I've put out a couple of videos recently about the Coe Ridge people and the Carmel Indians, Melungeons, who migrated to southern Ohio. Both of those videos garnered a lot of interest, and I wanted to come today to the Panhandle of Florida to talk about a separate and unique triracial isolate group, the Dominickers. Now, the Dominicker is an exonym. That's a name that they prefer not to be called themselves, but I'm unable to find any of them that are still around. Actually, they say that by the 1930s, they'd essentially lost their distinct identity, and they used this church right here. Their story is fascinating. It involves migration from a number of places around the country, a love story between the Yuchi Indians and a settler from the Scottish Highlands who married his daughter to the son of the chief who he had a friendship with, and the Dominickers themselves, they called themselves Spanish or Cuban because they didn't want to accept the mixed race label. They would not live in black communities. Even though local census takers often classified them as colored, they demanded to live in their own communities. And because they weren't admitted to the whites, they lived out in the swamps and originally had the old Zion Baptist Church, which was a wooden building until a new one was constructed in the 1940s. The building right here was made in the 1960s of cinder blocks and is still in use. In today's video, I'm going to tell you more about the Dominickers and their history, but I kind of want to see some of their graves first. This is the Zion Baptist Church, still in use, that used to belong to the Dominicker community. In fact, the original wooden church was actually built specifically for them because they refused to go to segregated churches or segregated schools. The graveyard behind the old Zion Baptist Church in the outskirts of Ponce de Leon, right here in the Holmes County of the Florida Panhandle, is where the Dominickers have been buried throughout the generations. Now, before I go into their stories, I'd really like to tell you their origins, or at least their folkloric origins, beginning with a colonel who was born in the Highlands of Scotland. Most stories about the Dominickers only really discuss the ones counted in the 1950 census, the several dozen people who lived in Holmes County. But I wanted to kind of dial back the clock to a couple of legends about their origin right down here in Walton County, and it really wraps up the man buried on the left, a native of the Isle of Skye, Colonel John Love McKinnon. Now understand that he and several other families of Scottish Presbyterians moved to the Carolinas and eventually migrated on a wagon train in the 1820s right here to the Florida Panhandle. And when many Americans looked at the natives as savages and hostile, they actually were very friendly with them. And the McKinnon family had a house just across the way from a very friendly Yuchi camp. And one of the men there was named Chief Sam Story. His real name was Timpucci Kennard, and it was his son, according to some legends, that was the progenitor of the Dominickers. See, Colonel McKinnon was a very wise man from Scotland, and in settling here he had befriended the local chief, Timpucci Kennard. But Timpucci died in the early 1830s, sometime around 1832, and is still buried in the swamps. He had a very smart, tall young son named Jim Crow, and after a little while, Jim Crow took a liking to one of the enslaved women that was property of Colonel John McKinnon. He allowed the chief's son, Jim Crow, to marry a young woman named Harriet that he had enslaved on his plantation. Harriet may have either been a full-blooded slave or half-black, half-wife. She may have actually been the colonel's biological daughter. The wedding was typical. He allowed her to go off into the woods into Crow's tent and hop the broomstick, which was a story that also came up when talking about the Coe Ridge people. I think that's a very interesting little side story that weddings were performed that way. It was very ceremonial. He then allowed them to come back to the plantation and live in a cottage at the far end of the row of slave cottages he had on his property, where they had a daughter of their own, a woman named Eliza. Pretty soon, their daughter Eliza married Jim Harris, a mixed-race young man brought to Florida by the McLean family. Their child was named Love Harris, who was by all accounts a beautiful girl. Sometime around 1875, Love Harris, or Lovey Harris, married Walton Potter, another mixed-race man. Their children began to have more kids with other mixed-race people who settled the area, possibly forming a unique class of Scottish Yuchi aristocracy. I think it's a shame how little information there is out there about the Dominickers, and what little I've seen on the internet almost never mentions the involvement of the settlement of the Gaelic-speaking Scottish Presbyterians who moved from the Isle of Skye to the Carolinas, and then in 1826, in mass wagon trains, moved down here to the Florida Panhandle, where they sort of set up plantations right around Walton County. They counted in their ranks the McKinnons, the Douglases, McIvers, the Campbells, the McRaes, McLeans, and many other interesting families. Many of them are actually buried right here in this cemetery with Colonel John Love McKinnon. Colonel John Love McKinnon was born in 1790 in the Isle of Skye, a Gaelic speaker to a Presbyterian family in Scotland. After 1795, his parents and siblings moved him to Richmond County, North Carolina. There, he grew to be a 6'6" giant of a man, very athletic, good with swimming, and he decided to really lead the charge of his family in moving right down here to the Florida Panhandle. It was here that he encountered the encampment of Yuchi Native Americans who had been beleaguered after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Many of these graves actually mark them as a native of the Highlands of Scotland. Same here, Alexander McCaskill, a native of the Highlands of Scotland, born 1775. Like many of the Scottish settlers of the Florida Panhandle, John Love McKinnon took an American wife, Catherine Douglas, who was also very sympathetic to the Native Americans. As the story goes, she took in 2 small native boys during the Seminole War and allowed them to hide in their house while the soldiers went out looking to kill them. She was born in 1803 in Richmond County, North Carolina, which is initially where the McKinnons settled before they decided to move to the Florida Panhandle. So some genealogy data I've seen online says that wagon train came from North Carolina in 1826, but at least from this gravestone, I can see that some of the Gunn clan were born on the Isle of Skye and settled in Yuchi Valley several years prior, and they came from Moore County, North Carolina. Now, as you can probably tell by the story involving Colonel Love McKinnon and the daughter of Hannah, one of his slaves, with the son of Chief Timpucci Bernard, the offspring that were the progenitors of the Dominickers were an incredibly proud people. And in the Deep South, usually if you were any kind of dark-skinned person that wasn't just Latino, and including Latinos, you would be segregated into the colored part of town. You would live on the opposite side of the railroad tracks, you would live among the descendants of the freed slaves, you would live in the black part of the community. But none of the Dominickers wanted to be a part of that community. So, over the generations, they built up a reputation, an undeserved one, but a reputation nonetheless as outlaws and rogues. They refused to go to colored schools, they refused to go to segregated churches, so they built one here, and they more or less lived on their own, only occasionally coming into Ponce de Leon to refill on supplies. This was something that made them a bit of an oddity around the Florida Panhandle, and for the most part, people just didn't talk about it because people back then were just unequipped to talk about racial issues like this. When the country is facing economic hardship, people tend to embrace racism because it makes them feel a little bit better about their personal lives. And that was no different in 1930 when the census-taking methods changed. Up until that point, the Dominickers often would have different classifications for different people in their family. A man marked as mulatto and a wife who was common law marked as white would have several different children, some of them black, some white, and some mixed race or mulatto. However, in 1930, in the middle of the Great Depression, the county here in the state of Florida, it adopted the Southern Bloc strategy of classifying as black if there were even any question about identity. So one drop would make you colored on the census. And this carried over for several years until the 1930s, the late 1930s, and around that time most of the people had more or less assimilated into the white community, but as a class they still lived pretty separate and continued using this Baptist church. But like I said, very few of them accepted the label of Dominicker. The label Dominicker itself is actually seen as an outsider pejorative because, according to legend, there was a divorce between a common law couple, and one of the men said to the judge, well, she had a baby and it came out all speckled just like a Dominicker, which is a type of chicken. Now, obviously, they wouldn't take too kindly to this label, and the ones who didn't say that they were just dark-skinned with a suntan would usually claim they were Cuban or Latino, or even sometimes they would claim that Yuchi heritage, but very seldom did they claim the mixed-race black heritage. One of the big theories about the early origins of the Dominickers that incorporates an added element, one that doesn't really count on the Scottish kernel, that is the earlier graves in this cemetery. Allens, Mayos, Halls, Shavers, Mayners, and Thomases can all be found on the 1810 to 1820 censuses of Northampton, North Carolina, and the Halls and Thomases sold a chunk of the Lumbee Reservation. The first burials in this cemetery are those of the Hall family. 24 Halls can be found in this cemetery. That would mean that many people from the Lumbee Reservation migrated to this community, and if you add those two historic events, the slave woman who had a child with the Yuchi chief's son, and the later migration of the Lumbee people, you can also add in the fact that quite a few Oxendeans, people who are very distinctly Lumbee, are buried a little bit north around Orlando and just in the North Florida, generally North Florida area. So you can see that in the Panhandle, quite a few people who were vaguely mixed race moved in around the same time a vibrant mixed community was beginning to form. There's also about a dozen members of the Thomas family here, which supports the idea that Hall and Thomas sold the land from their reservation and moved right here to the Panhandle in Holmes County. There are also about 30 Goddens, 30 Simonses, 24 Forehands, and a half dozen other Blands. I'll link to it in the comments, but in 1950, the federal government broke from the rules established by the Deep South in 1930, which meant that if you had one drop of black blood, you were classified as black on the census. In 1950, they sent out U.S. Census Bureau and U.S. Public Health Service workers to investigate claims that quite a few people around the Southeast were mixed race with black, white, and Native American ancestors. Apparently, one of the workers by the name of Beale was very interested in some of the Dominickers, and he published some notes he had when he visited here in 1950. At that time, he says, there was only one local man who self-identified as a Dominicker, and he's buried right here in this cemetery, a man named Jim Simmons. As a whole, this group didn't, at least in 1956 or 1950, like to be called Dominicker because it would imply they were mixed race. Jim claimed to be Spanish and Indian, and while there, Beale, who was with the census at that time, remarked that one of the patients was very angry. See, he went to the hospital, and when this patient had a baby, the hospital nurse decided to classify it as black on the birth certificate. And this woman threw a fit saying her baby wasn't black, she was white, she was Latino. Don't classify this baby as a colored child, which shows some of the odd racial dynamics in the early 1950s right here in the Florida Panhandle. One of the interesting things that Beale wrote about in his short article about the Dominickers of the Panhandle is that Holmes County didn't even have a dentist because the Dominickers had such superior teeth that there wasn't really a need for one. It's pretty interesting, just as an aside. In that same article, when he was talking with the nurses, Beale said they claimed the Forehand, the Godden family with several different spellings of their surname, and the Thomas families were all very well known as Dominickers, and supposedly they suspected the Curry family, but the Curry family wasn't that dark-skinned. Again, it's interesting to dial back the clock to the early 1950s and see what emphasis was placed on race in the Deep South. And we're here at a couple of the graves again in the Old Zion Baptist Church Cemetery, and I want to read you a direct quote from the Federal Writers Project, which is the first time that the Dominicker community's existence was made known to the outside world. This quote says, "The beginning of the Dominicker settlement was before the Civil War in 1855 by a black man named Joe Thomas. A slave raised a family of 4 children, 1 boy and 3 girls, by a white woman named Polly Thomas. She owned the black man after her husband was killed, and she took her slave for a husband and raised the 4 children." I should make some corrections here, but it seems like there's a little bit of truth to this story, because Benjamin Thomas, also known as Joe Thomas, was a free man of color, but not a slave. He existed, and their marriage must have been off the record because no priest would have ever officiated it. This would have meant immediate annulment and a public flogging. It was clearly a common law marriage, and I've already mentioned this about the Dominickers. No priests would officiate their weddings. Their son was named Berrien Thomas, and he's buried right here. He married a white woman named Raleigh Hall, a descendant of the original Lumbee settlers who set up here in the 1820s. Their daughter was named Martha, and she married a white man named Bill Bland. And you can see here a very early birth. 1830, and he lived a very long life, which is common for the Melungeons, although this group is a little different from the Melungeons. He lived all the way up to 1913. So you can see that this community wasn't really living in the black part of town as segregation demanded, but they weren't living in the white, so they more or less set up on their own, and if you had no other place to go, oftentimes you would set up here as well. However, because it became more popular with whites who were fleeing from justice or just trying to live where they wouldn't be bothered by the trappings of outside society, it really sort of watered down any of the darker features, and by World War II, most of these folks who served in the military were actually serving as white. And right behind the church, through the gates, is William Bland. And like I said, many of the white men who settled here were sort of outlaws or wanted to get away from society. There's some fascinating photos of William Bland on Find a Grave. Their son was named Berrien Thomas, who's buried here. He married a white woman named Raleigh Hall, a descendant of the original Lumbee settlers who moved here after the 1820s. Their daughter was named Martha, and she married a white man named Bill Bland, or William Bland, who is posing with guns in one of the photos he has on his memorial page. And from this union, many Bland family offshoots were created, quite a few of them in the back of the cemetery. And by the way, many of these graves are, to this day, unmarked, or marked only with white crosses. The pastor of this church gave me this CD documenting the cemetery here, and he explained that back in the 1980s, someone told him that they were a child in a Bible study, and that they had set up some of these white crosses. They were falling apart even back in the 1980s, so they had to set up new monuments. Apparently, it was kind of an itinerant community, and quite a few of these graves that are still unmarked were people who were just passing through and who died, but the church wanted to give them a Christian burial. And for an interesting depiction of some of these more obscure racial issues, I recommend Free State of Jones, because it keeps cutting to a civil rights era Mississippi trial with a descendant of one of the pro-union men who had a child with a freed woman of color, and generations later, his grandson looked sort of similar to this, although this man is more of a triracial isolate than he is a mixed-race black and white. And you can see how in the 1930s and 1940s, people would look at someone like Mr. Barnhouse here, James Paul Barnhouse, and wonder if he was really pure blood, or at least as pure blood as they expected. And you can also tell a lot from the unique burial styles of certain groups in the Deep South. Oftentimes, the incredibly poor or mixed race or black folks in the Deep South would use marbles to decorate their graves, homemade grave slabs. And these are beautiful, and a telltale feature of African American graves is shells, often representing those they lost on the journey from Africa. And this is a very interesting homemade wooden grave slab. And you've got right behind the church many of the family names that were associated with the Dominickers. The Simmonses.
Yeah, it's just the other one was a...
Behind here you have a Simmons.
The school class was
the Forehands buried behind them.
I mean, estimate was 1905 to 1910 somewhere for
the Goddens buried over here to the left. And then these two spots for urns. And I just spoke to the pastor of the church, who was a very nice man, and he let me see some photos of the old community. He wanted me to see this little sign over here that says it was rebuilt in '68. He also pointed out the original building wasn't so much a church, it was a school during the week, it was a community center, it was sort of one of those buildings when the community didn't have quote-unquote official religious leaders. They would meet there, and you can see here a couple names associated with the Dominickers. I didn't want to videotape any of their faces inside the church building, but I do hope to come back one day and talk to some of the community leaders if they will have me. I noticed that a lot of them looked almost the same as the photos they published about the Dominickers in the Great Depression with the Writers Project. These folks have black hair, very slightly tan skin. Some people would be able to pass for part Latino, but back in the day, that was very upsetting to the very fragile sensibilities of people who were always on the lookout for mixed race to segregate into different communities. So even when I walked up and asked some of the people standing in front of the church who looked similar to those photos from decades ago, someone said, "What do you mean, like the hens? The chickens? Dominickers?" Most of them didn't even know about the community. The pastor did, but he didn't really know enough to talk about them. So I'm hoping to put a little video out and really give their history. I should also point out that the original church used for the Dominickers did burn down before they built a new one, and that, as far as I can tell, at least according to the pastor, is now no longer standing. Pastor Chris from the old Mount Zion Baptist Church told me there was a nice Methodist church with a really fascinating graveyard up at Otter Creek, just outside of Ponce de Leon. I told him I'd go and visit it, and didn't realize that was actually the next place I actually had bookmarked. In this cemetery, there are many graves of the Mayo family, which factor in to the story of the Dominickers, but it also runs parallel to them, because the Mayos are more understood in Louisiana as the progenitors of the Redbones, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. The Mayo family actually have many graves in this county, and I was speaking to the pastor over at Old Mount Zion who says he knows a Mayo, so they still live in this community. Legend says that Alfred Mayo, the patriarch of the family, led a mixed-blood wagon train from here, from Holmes County, to Louisiana, because many of the Mayo family were from the Catawba or Lumbee tribes who fled the Panhandle to avoid persecution and live freely in Louisiana. And when they got there, according to family folklore, they swore an oath on the Bible to never tell of their true racial origins. Now you might be wondering, why would they want to hide their identities so well if they were members of the Catawba or Lumbee people? After all, those are Native Americans, and although they were looked down on, they weren't looked down on as hardly as the mixed-race, partly black people who also lived in Holmes County, the Dominickers. Well, the Lumbee and the Catawba are a tri-racial isolate people, and because they are part black, usually the ancestors of maroons or freedmen of color or slaves who escaped into the swamp to live freely, and mixed with outlaws and Native Americans who also lived outside of white settlements, they formed their own distinct culture. And actually it was only after Trump was placed in office that he announced an executive order to begin the process of federally recognizing the Lumbee tribe. Now, because people started to suspect that they might be partly black, that is when Alfred Mayo made the move to Louisiana. Some of the Mayo family stayed behind, especially if they were too sick or old to make the journey. One of those was Matilda Mayo, who's buried here, and she passed away in 1922, right here in Ponce de Leon. Her husband died in Confederate service, but one of her brothers is buried in DeSoto Parish, Louisiana, the sort of beating heart of Redbone territory, which shows that her family did make the trip. Not only that, but her father-in-law was Alfred Mayo, who's the one that organized the wagon train and made the descendants of the family swear on the Bible to not tell that they were mixed race. And naturally, they were very mysterious to the others who lived around the parish, who began calling them Redbones. This is only one of the Mayos buried in this county, many of whom have ties to Louisiana, and many more Mayos are buried in Bonifay. Most sources say the Dominickers are unique and untied to other racial groups, but I think this connection to the Mayos establishes a pretty clear connection to the Lumbees, to the Catawba, and to the Redbones of Louisiana. And isn't it so fascinating that the Dominickers are buried in the old Mount Zion cemetery, and yet surrounding us are many Mayos who are very well tied to the Lumbee, the Catawba, and the triracial isolate people who essentially came down here to the Panhandle to escape the persecution they were facing up in the Carolinas, burying themselves in a totally separate community in the same backyards shared with the Dominickers. And Matilda Mayo's father was Ichabod Norris, so the main families that migrated here from the Carolinas and are probably Lumbee or Catawba are the Norrises and Mayos. And again, Alf Mayo is the one who led the Redbones to Louisiana and intentionally obscured their mixed-race identities.